Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm fully aware that for a lot of you, my voice is the last thing you hear before you fall asleep. So, before you're out cold, I thought it would be cool if you left a comment telling me what part of the world you're in. And of course, if you like what we do here, please like and subscribe. Now, sit back, relax, in this news story. Never enter these West Virginia woods during a storm. The locals in the deep valleys of West Virginia have a saying about the sudden summer storms. They claim that the rain does not just wash away the dirt, but it also uncovers the past. There are ridges in the Monongahela National Forest where the trees grow so thick that noon looks like twilight. It is a place where cellular signals die and the only guidance comes from a compass and a map. In the summer of 2021, a survey team hiked into this green abyss and found something disturbing. What they discovered in the driving rain would change the way they looked at the wilderness forever. The official report was filed as a weather-related incident, but the details within it tell a darker story. Elias Thorne was a surveyor with a private land management firm that was based out of Charleston. He was 34 years old and had spent most of his adult life measuring the wild places of the state. He was a man of few words who preferred the company of trees to the noise of the city. His partner for this particular job was a contractor named Silas Vane, who knew the mountains by heart. Silas was older, with gray stubble on his chin and a pair of eyes that constantly scanned the brush. They were tasked with marking the boundary line of a remote parcel that had recently been sold to the state. The terrain was steep and rocky, which made the progress slow and the footing treacherous for both men. The morning had started with a clear blue sky that gave no hint of the violence that was to come. They parked their truck at the end of an old logging road and hiked 5 miles into the dense forest. Elias carried the heavy tripod and the total station, while Silas hauled the marker stakes and the bush clearing tools. They worked in a comfortable rhythm and communicated mostly with hand signals and the occasional nod of the head. By early afternoon, the air began to feel heavy and the birds suddenly stopped their singing in the canopy. Elias looked up and saw a wall of bruise-colored clouds moving rapidly over the crest of the western ridge. They decided to pack up the gear immediately and head back toward the truck before the weather broke. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes, and the wind began to whip the treetops. They were still 3 miles from the vehicle when the first drops of rain hit the dry leaves like bullets. The sky opened up and released a torrent of water that turned the trail into a sliding river of mud. Visibility was reduced to a few yards, and the thunder crashed so loud that they could feel it in their chests. Silas shouted over the roar of the wind that they needed to find shelter until the worst of it passed. They scrambled off the trail and headed toward a rock outcropping that Silas remembered seeing on a previous trip to the area. The rain was blinding, and the lightning strikes were getting uncomfortably close to their position on the slope. They slipped and slid through the undergrowth and grabbed at roots and saplings to keep from tumbling down the ravine. It was during this desperate scramble that Elias spotted a shape that did not belong in the natural landscape. Tucked beneath the overhang of a massive sandstone cliff was a structure that looked like a shed or a small cabin. It was built from rough-hewn logs and covered with a camouflage tarp that made it nearly invisible. Silas hesitated for a moment because he knew that stumbling upon a hidden cabin in these woods could be dangerous. People who built this far out usually did so because they wanted to be left alone by the world. But the storm was raging with a fury that made the risk of exposure seem like the lesser of two evils. They approached the structure with their hands raised and called out to announce their presence to anyone inside. There was no answer, and the only sound was the hammering of the rain against the plastic tarp on the roof. Elias reached the door, which was made of heavy plywood, and found that it was not locked or barred. They stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind them to cut off the deafening noise of the storm. The interior was dry and smelled strongly of wood smoke and old paper and something metallic like gun oil. Elias clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam around the single room to see what they had walked into. It was not a temporary shelter for a hunter, but a fully established living space with shelves and furniture. There was a bunk built against the far wall with a sleeping bag that looked clean and recently used. A small wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of dry kindling ready to be lit. Silas moved to the table in the center of the room and pointed his own light at the objects scattered across the surface. There were detailed topographic maps of the surrounding counties that were covered in handwritten notes and red circles. Elias leaned in closer and saw that the circles were not marking hunting grounds or fishing spots as he expected. They were marking the locations of trailhead parking lots and the scenic overlooks along the highway. Next to the maps was a stack of spiral-bound notebooks that looked like they had been filled over many years. The spine of the top notebook was labeled with the year 2019 written in black marker. Elias opened the book and began to read the entries, which were written in a neat and precise script. The writer described watching people arrive at the trailheads and noting the cars they drove and the gear they carried. The entries were clinical and detached, as if the author was studying a species of animal rather than human beings. There were descriptions of solo hikers and couples and notes on how long they stayed in the woods. The most chilling part was a column on the right side of the page that listed the estimated police response times. The person who lived here was not just watching hikers, but was also measuring the gaps in the law enforcement coverage. Silas called Elias over to the shelves on the back wall, where a row of plastic bins was stacked neatly. He popped the lid off the top bin and shone his light inside to reveal a collection of items. There were wallets and sets of car keys and several pairs of sunglasses that were scratched and worn. Elias picked up a wallet and opened it to find a driver license belonging to a man from Ohio. He recognized the face from a missing person flyer that he had seen on a gas station window months ago. The man had vanished while hiking on a trail that was supposed to be 10 miles north of this location. The realization hit them both at the same time that they were standing in the home of a predator. This was not just a squatter camp, but a trophy room for someone who had been operating in these woods for years. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background as the silence of the room pressed in on them. They needed to leave immediately and get to a place where they could use their radio to call for help. Elias put the wallet in his pocket as evidence and turned to the door just as a noise stopped him cold. It was the sound of a heavy latch clicking open on the other side of the plywood door. They froze in place and killed their flashlights instantly to plunge the room into absolute pitch-black darkness. The door creaked open slowly, and a silhouette appeared against the gray light of the rainy afternoon outside. A figure in a heavy rain slicker stepped into the cabin and shook the water off their hood. The person did not see them standing in the corners of the room and proceeded to close the door and lock it. Elias held his breath, and his heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it would be heard. The stranger took a lighter from their pocket, and the sudden flame illuminated a face that was weathered and calm. It was an older man with deep lines etched into his skin and eyes that looked tired rather than malicious. He lit a kerosene lantern that hung from a hook on the ceiling, and the warm glow filled the small space. He turned toward the table and stopped dead when he saw the muddy boot prints on the floorboards. The man did not panic or reach for a weapon, but simply sighed and looked toward the dark corners. He spoke in a voice that was rough like gravel and asked them to step into the light. Elias and Silas stepped forward with their hands visible and tried to explain that they were only seeking shelter. The man listened to their story without blinking and then walked over to the wood stove to light a fire. He told them his name was Arthur and that he had lived in these woods since the late 90s. Elias asked him about the wallets and the maps and the license of the missing hiker from Ohio. Arthur sat down heavily on a wooden crate and looked at the items on the table with a strange expression. He explained that he did not hurt those people, but he was the one who found what they left behind. He claimed that the woods took people who were unprepared or unlucky, and he merely collected the pieces. He told them that he had tried to report the things he found years ago, but the police had looked at him with suspicion. They had accused him of being involved and had raided his camp and destroyed his meager belongings. So he stopped calling them and started keeping his own records of the tragedies that happened in the forest. He said the man from Ohio had fallen from the ridge during a storm just like this one. Arthur had found the body days later and covered it with stones because he could not carry it out. He kept the wallet to remember the name of the soul that was lost to the mountain. Elias wanted to believe him, but the meticulous notes on the police response times told a different story. It suggested that Arthur was tracking the authorities to avoid them while he did something else. Silas asked why he tracked the hikers at the trailheads if he was just a passive observer of the woods. Arthur hesitated for a long time, and the sound of the fire crackling was the only noise in the room. Finally, he admitted that he watched them to see who was respectful of the land and who was careless. He said that sometimes he would follow the careless ones to make sure they did not start fires or leave trash. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the storm continued to batter the cabin. Elias noticed a loose floorboard near the bunk that looked like it had been pried up recently. He asked Arthur what was under the floor, and the old man went rigid with a sudden flash of anger. Arthur stood up and told them that the storm was passing and it was time for them to leave his home. Silas put a hand on Elias's arm to signal that they should go while they still had the chance to walk away. They backed toward the door and thanked the man for the shelter while keeping their eyes on his hands. They stepped back out into the rain, which had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the wind had died down. They walked fast and did not look back until they were well into the tree line and out of sight. As soon as they were clear, they broke into a run and scrambled up the muddy slope toward the ridge. They did not stop until they reached the truck and locked the doors with shaking hands. Elias grabbed the radio microphone and called the dispatch center to report the location of the cabin and the items they found. The dispatcher told them to stay put and that a deputy was on the way to their location. 2 hours later, they led a team of officers back down the trail to the spot where they had found the structure. The woods were quiet and the mist was rising from the ground in thick white ribbons. When they reached the sandstone cliff, they found the spot where the cabin had stood, but the structure was gone. The logs had been pulled down and scattered, and the tarp was missing, along with all the contents of the room. It looked like the site had been abandoned for years rather than just a few hours. The only thing that remained was a patch of dry earth where the floor had been and the smell of smoke. The officers searched the area and found a fresh set of ATV tracks leading away into the deep brush. They followed the tracks for a mile until they disappeared into a rocky stream bed that showed no trail. The search for Arthur and his mobile cabin continued for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. The license of the missing man from Ohio that Elias had taken was the only physical proof that the encounter happened. It led the authorities to the location Arthur had described, and they found the remains of the hiker under a pile of stones. The cause of death was determined to be accidental, just as the old man had said. But the mystery of the notebook and the surveillance of the trailheads still haunted Elias long after the case went cold. He spent his evenings looking at the copies of the map notes he had memorized in that short time. He realized that the red circles on the map formed a pattern that matched the migration of rare ginseng plants. It was possible that Arthur was protecting a valuable illegal harvest rather than hunting people. Or perhaps he was guarding something ancient in the woods that he felt responsible for keeping safe. The ambiguity of the man's motives made the memory of the encounter even more unsettling. Months later, Elias received a package in the mail with no return address and a postmark from a town 3 counties away. Inside the package was a single page torn from a spiral notebook with handwriting he recognized immediately. The note simply listed the date of the storm and the names of Elias and Silas and the time they entered the woods. At the bottom of the page was a short message that warned them to stay on the marked trails in the future. It was a clear signal that Arthur was still out there and he was still watching the people who entered his domain. Elias never went back to that specific ridge, and he eventually transferred to a desk job in the city. The feeling of being watched in the woods never left him, and he found he could no longer enjoy the silence of the forest. He often wondered how many other cabins were out there, hidden beneath the cliffs and the rhododendrons. The wilderness is vast, and it keeps its secrets well from those who do not know where to look. The story of the surveyor and the hermit became a local legend that was whispered in the gear shops and the diners. Most people dismissed it as a tall tale or an exaggeration of a simple encounter with a homeless drifter. But those who worked in the deep woods knew that there was truth in the warning. There are people who live in the margins of the map who have stepped out of society and into something else. They play by a different set of rules, and they do not welcome intruders into their world. The storm had pulled back the curtain for a brief moment and revealed a reality that was best left unseen. The final twist came a year later when a large illegal logging operation was busted in the same sector of the forest. The police found a network of spotters who used hidden camps to track the movements of the rangers and the surveyors. They found a notebook in the main office of the logging company that matched the description of the one Elias saw. It turned out that Arthur was not a hermit, but a sentry for a criminal enterprise that was stealing millions in timber. He had played the part of the eccentric protector to throw Elias and Silas off the scent of the real crime. The missing hiker story was a convenient cover that he used to explain the items he had scavenged or stolen. The reality was far more organized and cold-blooded than a simple man living off the land. The loose floorboard likely hid the cash payments or the radio equipment he used to communicate with the loggers. Elias realized that his survival that day had been a calculation rather than an act of mercy. Killing 2 surveyors would have brought too much heat to the operation, so Arthur had let them go with a ghost story. It was a chilling reminder that the dangers in the woods are often human rather than natural. The romantic idea of the solitary mountain man was just a mask for greed and exploitation. Elias still looks at the tree line when storms roll in and wonders who is watching from the shadows. He knows now that the eyes in the forest are not always wild, and the thunder can hide the sound of falling trees. The woods of West Virginia are beautiful, but they are also a place where silence can be a weapon. And sometimes the most terrifying thing you can find is a friendly stranger in a warm cabin. Night Guard refused to watch the security monitor. The expansive retail complex known as Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, was once a thriving hub of commerce, but by 2022, it had become a desolate structure of crumbling concrete and shattered glass. Elias Thorne was a 44-year-old private security contractor who had been assigned to the property to monitor the site for arsonists and urban explorers. Thorne was a former logistics manager who had lost his job during the economic downturn and took the night watch position because it offered solitude and steady pay. He was known among his colleagues as a rational and meticulous man who relied heavily on procedure and documentation. Thorne arrived for his shift on the evening of November 4th, 2022, prepared for another uneventful 12 hours of sitting in the command center. Dispatch logs from that night indicate that he checked in with the central office at 1800 hours and reported that all perimeter gates were locked and secure. The security office was located on the ground floor near the former food court, and it served as the nerve center for the few remaining active systems in the building. Thorne sat in a worn ergonomic chair, facing a wall of 12 high-definition LCD monitors that provided views of the main concourses and loading docks. The room was kept at a chilly 60 degrees to protect the server racks that hummed loudly in the corner. Thorne spent the first few hours of his shift reviewing the playback from the previous day and filling out digital activity reports on a tablet. He had developed a habit of scanning the monitors in a specific clockwise pattern to ensure he never missed a frame of activity. However, there was one screen in the bottom right corner labeled Camera 4 that he had subconsciously started to avoid during his sweeps. This feed displayed the entrance to the defunct department store wing, which had been sealed off from the main mall by a heavy metal shutter. State records regarding the property show that the department store wing had been slated for demolition 3 years prior, but the funding had fallen through at the last minute. The area was completely devoid of electricity, and the only light source came from the infrared sensors on the security camera itself. Thorne later stated in an interview with local law enforcement that Camera 4 often displayed visual artifacts that looked like shadows moving across the lens. He attributed these glitches to the aging wiring and the damp conditions inside the unheated structure. Maintenance logs from October 2022 reveal that Thorne had requested a repair for Camera 4 multiple times, citing intermittent signal loss. The request was marked as pending by the facility's management team due to a lack of available parts. Thorne was forced to work with the faulty equipment and often adjusted the contrast settings to minimize the visual noise. The incident began at approximately 2:15 in the morning when the silence of the security office was broken by a sharp beep from the motion detection system. Thorne looked up from his reading material and saw that the alert was coming from the monitor connected to Camera 4. He leaned closer to the screen and squinted against the grainy black and white image to identify the source of the trigger. The hallway on the screen appeared empty at first glance, with nothing but dust motes floating in the infrared beam. Thorne checked the other monitors to see if anyone had breached the external doors, but all other feeds showed quiet corridors. He assumed it was another malfunction and reached for the mouse to reset the alarm sensor. Reportedly, his hand froze mid-air when he noticed a dark shape standing perfectly still near the bottom edge of the frame. The figure on the screen was difficult to distinguish from the surrounding shadows because of the poor image quality and the distance of the camera. Thorne described the intruder as a person of average build wearing heavy winter clothing that absorbed the infrared light. The person was standing with their back to the camera and facing the metal shutter that blocked the entrance to the main mall area. Thorne felt a surge of adrenaline and immediately grabbed his two-way radio to contact the off-site dispatch supervisor. He spoke in a hushed tone and reported a Code 6, which was the internal designation for a trespassing in progress. The supervisor instructed Thorne to remain in the locked security office and to continue monitoring the situation while they contacted the Akron Police Department. Thorne acknowledged the order and kept his eyes fixed on the figure on camera 4. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly as Thorne watched the intruder on the screen without blinking. He expected the person to produce a spray paint can or a crowbar, which were the standard tools of the vandals he usually encountered. Instead, the figure simply stood there with an unnatural stillness that Thorne found deeply unsettling. There was no shifting of weight and no movement of the head or arms to suggest the person was looking around. Archived notes from the security company investigation suggest that Thorne began to doubt his own perception after 10 minutes of inactivity. He adjusted the brightness on the monitor in an attempt to get a clearer view of the intruder's clothing or features. The adjustment caused the screen to flicker briefly, but when the image stabilized, the figure was still there in the exact same position. The atmosphere in the security office became oppressive as Thorne waited for the sound of police sirens to cut through the night. He glanced at the timestamp on the monitor and realized that 20 minutes had passed since he first spotted the intruder. Suddenly, the figure on the screen began to move, but it was not a natural human motion. Thorne told investigators that the figure rotated slowly on the spot without taking any steps, as if it were on a turntable. The movement was smooth and mechanical, and it resulted in the intruder facing directly toward the camera lens. The camera was mounted 12 feet high on a concrete pillar, so the figure had to tilt its head back at a severe angle to look into the lens. Thorne recoiled in his chair and pushed himself away from the desk as he stared at the face on the monitor. The facial features of the intruder were completely obscured by a patch of digital distortion that looked like a block of static. Thorne stated that the rest of the image was relatively clear, but the face was a swirling mass of gray pixels. He felt a sudden wave of nausea and a distinct feeling that he was being watched by something malevolent. The dispatch logs show that Thorne keyed his radio microphone again at 2:38 in the morning, but said nothing. The recording captures only the sound of his rapid breathing and the hum of the servers in the background. He later admitted that he was too terrified to speak because he felt that the figure on the screen could somehow hear him. He made the decision to look away from the monitor and focused his gaze on the door of the security office to ensure it was locked. Police units arrived at the perimeter of the mall at 2:45 in the morning and announced their presence over the public address system. Thorne heard the officers banging on the loading dock doors and finally found the courage to stand up and let them in. He led the two officers through the maze of service corridors toward the department store wing while explaining what he had seen. The group arrived at the sealed entrance and found the metal shutter intact and locked from the inside. The officers used a master key to open a service door and entered the wing with their tactical flashlights drawn. Thorne stayed back near the entrance while the police swept the area for any sign of the intruder. The beam of the flashlights cut through the stale air and revealed a thick layer of undisturbed dust covering the floor. The officers cleared the hallway and the adjacent rooms within 15 minutes and returned to where Thorne was waiting. They informed him that the area was completely empty and there were no footprints in the dust other than their own. Thorne insisted that he had watched a man standing there for over 20 minutes and demanded they check the roof access points. The officers complied but found all roof hatches welded shut and secured with heavy rusted padlocks. County files from 2023 indicate that the responding officers filed the incident as a false alarm caused by equipment error. They noted in their report that Thorne appeared visibly shaken and was sweating profusely despite the cold temperature in the building. Thorne refused to accept their conclusion and led them back to the security office to show them the footage. Thorne sat down at the control desk and rewound the video feed for camera 4 to the time of the incident. He pressed play and waited for the figure to appear on the screen so he could vindicate himself. However, the playback showed nothing but an empty hallway for the entire duration of the time frame. The motion sensor log on the computer showed a trigger event at 2:15, but the video file associated with it was corrupted. The officers watched the static-filled screen for a few moments before telling Thorne to get some rest. They left the site at 3:30 in the morning, leaving Thorne alone in the office with the monitors. He spent the remainder of his shift sitting with his back to the wall, refusing to look at the bank of screens. The following morning, a senior technician from the security company arrived to perform a diagnostic on the system. Thorne watched as the technician traced the wiring for camera 4 from the server room out to the department store wing. The technician returned 30 minutes later with a puzzled expression and a bundle of loose wires in his hand. He explained to Thorne that the camera in the department store wing had been physically disconnected from the network. The wires had been severed cleanly, and the copper ends were oxidized, which suggested they had been cut weeks ago. This revelation meant that it was impossible for Thorne to have received a live feed from that camera during his shift. The monitor should have been displaying a blue signal loss screen instead of a view of the hallway. Thorne resigned from his position immediately after the technician delivered the news and refused to work out his notice period. He moved out of his apartment in Akron the following week and relocated to a rural town in West Virginia to live with his brother. He has refused all requests for interviews from journalists and urban exploration bloggers who have tried to contact him. The only person he confided in was his brother, who later shared the details of the story on a private internet forum for security professionals. The brother claimed that Thorne is still plagued by nightmares of the static-faced figure and refuses to be in rooms with televisions or computer monitors. Thorne remains convinced that what he saw was not a technical glitch, but something that was projecting itself onto the screen. Some locals claimed that the Rolling Acres Mall had been a site of tragic events long before it was abandoned. Archives from local newspapers mention a construction accident in the early 80s where a worker fell from the upper level of the department store wing. Rumors circulated for years among mall employees that the wing was haunted by the spirit of the deceased worker. However, investigators never confirmed any link between the accident and the security anomalies reported by Thorne. The skepticism surrounding the story is fueled by the lack of hard evidence and the convenient corruption of the video files. Yet the maintenance log discovered by a scavenger months later adds a complicating factor to the narrative. A group of urban explorers entered the mall in January 2023 and found a maintenance clipboard left behind in the security office. The log contained an entry signed by a different guard dated 2 days before Thorne's incident. The entry noted that camera 4 had been acting up and displaying images of people who were not there. This detail contradicts the official company's stance that the camera was simply broken and disconnected. It suggests that other employees had witnessed similar phenomena but had chosen not to report it officially. The explorers took photos of the logbook and uploaded them to a data sharing site before they were removed for copyright violations. The existence of this log implies a pattern of events that the security firm may have been trying to suppress. The security firm dissolved its contract with the property owners shortly after Thorne's resignation, citing hazardous working conditions. The mall remained abandoned until the city eventually moved forward with demolition plans to clear the site for an industrial park. The department store wing was the first section to be torn down by the wrecking crews in late 2023. During the demolition, workers reportedly found a small hidden room behind a false wall near the location where the figure had stood. Inside the room, they found a sleeping bag and a collection of batteries, but no identification. This discovery led some to believe that a squatter had been living in the walls and tapping into the camera system. However, this theory does not explain how the squatter could manipulate the video feed to show a figure when the camera was disconnected. The mystery of what Elias Thorne saw on the monitor remains one of the most debated topics in the online security community. Skeptics argue that isolation and sleep deprivation caused a detailed hallucination that Thorne's mind projected onto the screen. They point to the fact that the human brain seeks patterns in visual noise and can create faces out of static. Believers argue that the severed wires and the corroborating maintenance log point to something more unexplainable. They suggest that the entity in the mall did not need wires to transmit its image to the observer. The only certainty is that a rational man walked into a shift at Rolling Acres Mall and left with his life completely derailed by a feed from a broken camera. What the hikers heard inside the cave is unexplained. The dense woodlands of the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri conceal hundreds of documented caves and sinkholes that stretch for miles beneath the limestone bedrock. Mark Halloway was a 32-year-old amateur geologist who had spent the last 5 years mapping the lesser-known cavern systems in the region for a local university project. He was accompanied on the morning of October 14, 2023, by Sarah Jenkins, a 29-year-old paramedic, and David Ross, a 35-year-old software engineer. The group planned to explore a narrow fissure known locally as the Devil's Throat, which had been sealed by a rock slide in 1998 and recently reopened by heavy rainfall. Their objective was to survey the structural stability of the entrance and document any biological specimens they encountered in the antechamber. Dispatch logs from the county sheriff's office confirmed that the group filed a detailed itinerary and expected to return to the surface by 1800 hours that same day. The three hikers parked their vehicle at a trailhead 5 miles from the nearest paved road and hiked for 2 hours through rough terrain to reach the cave entrance. They were equipped with industrial-grade headlamps and climbing gear, along with digital audio recorders to capture notes during the descent. State records indicate that the weather that day was clear and unseasonably warm, which meant the cave system would be relatively dry and stable. Mark led the descent into the vertical shaft, while Sarah and David managed the safety ropes from the anchor point on the surface. The initial drop was 60 feet into a large limestone chamber that branched off into 3 smaller tunnels that had not been mapped since the 70s. Audio files recovered later revealed that the group was in high spirits and commented frequently on the pristine condition of the rock formations. The group decided to follow the central tunnel, which sloped downward at a steep 40-degree angle and appeared to lead toward an underground aquifer. They moved slowly and checked the oxygen levels with a handheld meter every 50 feet to ensure the air remained breathable. David mentioned in one of the recordings that the temperature dropped significantly as they passed the 300-foot depth marker. He described a heavy silence that seemed to swallow the sound of their boots scraping against the damp stone floor. They had been underground for approximately 3 hours when Sarah suddenly signaled for the group to stop moving. She claimed she could hear a rhythmic thumping sound echoing from deep within the tunnel ahead of them. The sound was faint at first, but it gradually grew louder and more distinct as they held their breath to listen. Mark assumed the noise was caused by water dripping onto a hollow rock surface, or perhaps the shifting of limestone plates settling deeper in the earth. He pulled out his high-fidelity audio recorder and pointed the directional microphone down the dark corridor to capture the anomaly for analysis. The recording from that moment captures a low-frequency pulse that repeats exactly every 4 seconds without variation. David noted that the rhythm was too precise to be a natural geological occurrence and suggested it sounded mechanical. The group debated whether to turn back, but Mark insisted they investigate the source to rule out the possibility of trapped miners or illegal excavation equipment. They proceeded cautiously down the tunnel for another 200 yards until the passage opened up into a massive cathedral-sized cavern. The cavern was filled with towering stalagmites and a large pool of stagnant water that reflected the beams of their flashlights. The rhythmic thumping sound stopped abruptly the moment they stepped into the open space, leaving them in total silence once again. Sarah reported feeling a sudden drop in air pressure that made her ears pop painfully and caused a wave of dizziness. She checked the atmospheric monitor, but the device showed stable readings for oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. David scanned the perimeter of the room with his light and spotted a dark recess on the far wall that looked like a man-made mine shaft. He walked toward it to investigate while Mark stayed near the water to collect sediment samples. It was at this moment that the audio recorder picked up a voice whispering directly into the microphone. The whisper on the tape is unintelligible to casual listeners, but forensic audio experts later claimed it contained distinct phonetic structures. The voice did not belong to any of the three hikers, as they were all standing several feet apart and facing away from the device. Mark did not hear the whisper in real time and continued his work near the water's edge, unaware of the anomaly. David called out from the far side of the room and said that the mine shaft was actually just a trick of the shadows and the wall was solid rock. The group regrouped in the center of the cavern and decided to head back to the surface as the atmosphere in the cave had become oppressive. Sarah mentioned that she felt like they were being watched from the ceiling, but she could see nothing but limestone when she looked up. The ascent back to the surface was difficult because the group was fatigued and the humidity in the tunnel had risen sharply for no apparent reason. They reached the vertical shaft at 17:30 hours and began the climb up the ropes one by one. Mark was the last to climb, and he later told investigators that he heard the rhythmic thumping sound return just as he cleared the lip of the drop. He paused on the rope and looked down into the darkness, but saw only the fading beam of his backup light, which he had dropped. He scrambled out of the hole, and the group hiked back to their vehicle in silence. They did not discuss the sounds they heard until they were back in the safety of the town and sitting in a diner. Mark uploaded the audio files to his laptop that evening and was shocked to find that the file size for the cavern recording was 3 times larger than it should have been. He opened the file in a sound editing program and saw a visual waveform that showed a constant wall of noise that was not audible during playback. The only audible parts were their voices and the rhythmic thumping that David had pointed out. However, when Mark isolated the background frequencies, he found a layer of audio that sounded like heavy machinery operating in the distance. This was impossible because the nearest industrial site was over 40 miles away from the Devil's Throat cave system. He saved the isolated clip and sent it to a colleague at the university who specialized in acoustic geology. The colleague analyzed the clip and determined that the sound waves exhibited characteristics of a large ventilation fan or a turbine. He noted that the frequency was consistent with industrial air circulation systems used in deep underground bunkers. This analysis contradicted the official Geological Survey maps, which stated that the area was solid bedrock with no man-made structures. Mark tried to return to the cave 2 weeks later to verify the findings, but found the entrance blocked by a fresh rock slide. A park ranger stationed at the trailhead informed him that the area had been closed off indefinitely due to seismic instability. The ranger refused to elaborate on when the instability had been detected or who had authorized the closure. Some locals in the nearby town of Winona claimed that military trucks had been seen entering the forest access roads late at night during that same week. A retired miner told a local reporter that there were old lead mines in the area that connected to natural caverns, but they had been sealed by the government in the 70s. He suggested that the sounds the hikers heard were likely echoes from unauthorized drilling operations that were being hidden from the public. However, the Department of Natural Resources issued a statement denying any mining permits in that sector of the Mark Twain National Forest. The official explanation for the noise was shifting tectonic plates, causing acoustic resonance in the limestone chambers. David Ross later posted a detailed account of the expedition on a forum for spelunkers and included the audio clip of the rhythmic thumping. The thread generated hundreds of theories ranging from underground rivers to secret government facilities. One user, who claimed to be a former audio engineer, analyzed the whisper on the tape and suggested it was a reversed speech pattern. When the clip was played backward, the whisper seemed to say a phrase that sounded like "protocol initiated." David eventually deleted the post and his account without explanation 3 months after the incident. Friends of David stated that he had become paranoid about his digital privacy and believed his computer was being monitored. Sarah Jenkins never returned to caving after that trip and focused her energy on her career as a paramedic. She told her family that the feeling of pressure she experienced in the cavern had resulted in permanent tinnitus in her left ear. Medical records from November 2023 show that she was treated for a ruptured eardrum consistent with exposure to rapid barometric pressure changes. The doctor noted in the file that such an injury was unusual for a recreational caver who had not descended below 500 feet. Sarah maintained that the air pressure in the room had shifted instantly, as if a massive vacuum had been turned on. Her testimony aligns with the theory of a ventilation system, but conflicts with the lack of physical vents in the cave. Mark continued his geological work, but shifted his focus away from the Devil's Throat area and onto surface formations. He kept the original recordings on a hard drive in a safe deposit box and refused to release the full raw files to the public. He claimed in a private email to his professor that there were other sounds on the tape that he had not noticed initially. These sounds were described as high-pitched screeches that were outside the range of human hearing, but visible on the spectrogram. He feared that releasing the data would discredit his academic reputation or draw unwanted attention from the authorities. The hard drive remains in storage, and the full extent of what was captured that day is known only to him. The mystery of the Devil's Throat Cave is further complicated by a missing persons report filed in 1999 regarding two campers in the same area. The campers had reported hearing strange mechanical noises in the woods just days before they vanished without a trace. Their campsite was found abandoned with all their gear intact, including their wallets and car keys. Investigators at the time found no evidence of foul play and eventually classified the case as an accidental disappearance due to getting lost. The proximity of their campsite to the cave entrance suggests a potential link that was never fully investigated. The file on the missing campers was sealed in 2010 and remains inaccessible to the public. The rhythmic thumping heard by the hikers remains the most tangible piece of evidence that something exists beneath the forest floor. Skeptics argue that the human brain often interprets random natural patterns as orderly mechanical sounds when under stress. They cite the phenomenon of pareidolia, where the mind imposes structure on chaos to make sense of the unknown. However, the digital evidence of the waveform and the physical injury to Sarah's ear provide hard data that is difficult to dismiss. The cave entrance remains buried under tons of rock and soil, ensuring that no one else can verify the source of the sound. The forest above continues to grow silent and undisturbed, masking whatever lies waiting in the dark below. In this news story, he thought the scratching was rats. It wasn't. In late autumn of 2014, strange noise complaints emerged from a secluded property in northern Maine. 32-year-old Arthur Pendleton lived alone and worked as a structural engineer evaluating old timber cabins. He initially dismissed the faint scraping sounds behind his drywall as common field mice seeking a winter shelter. County dispatch logs from November reveal a sudden escalation in his distress calls regarding the bizarre nighttime noises. What began as a mundane pest issue quickly evolved into an unresolved missing persons case lacking any explanation. Arthur had relocated to the Aroostook County region to study the architectural decay of several abandoned logging structures. His rented property was a refurbished two-story farmhouse situated roughly 14 miles away from the nearest town. For the first 3 weeks, state records indicate he maintained regular daily email contact with his Boston firm. Archived notes from his professional journals mention the surprising structural integrity of the local buildings he carefully surveyed. The surrounding dense forest provided a quiet environment for his highly technical and incredibly focused architectural assessment work. The engineer spent his early days driving a heavily modified utility truck across miles of unpaved dirt roads. He carried specialized measuring equipment designed to test the load-bearing capacity of century-old rotting wooden beams. The isolated farmhouse he rented served as a temporary base of operations for his extensive 3-month project. He reportedly chose this specific location because it offered quick access to deep forest trails and historic sites. Nobody in the nearby town knew much about his background or his ultimate reasons for taking the assignment. During his second week in the remote farmhouse, Arthur began noting minor acoustic anomalies in his daily journals. He wrote about a persistent low-frequency vibration that seemed to echo through the solid oak floorboards nightly. A county file from 2009 indicated the property sat on naturally shifting soil prone to settling. Arthur initially attributed these subtle sounds to thermal expansion within the old wooden framing as temperatures dropped rapidly. However, his professional expertise soon led him to question the unusual rhythm and distinct origin of the noises. The subtle vibrations eventually transitioned into distinct scratching sounds originating from inside the primary ground floor exterior walls. Some locals claimed the old farmhouse had a long history of attracting large raccoons during the colder months. Arthur visited a small local hardware store and purchased several heavy-duty animal traps and strong chemical repellents. He strategically placed the metal cages around the concrete foundation and along the edges of the dark crawl space. He fully expected to capture a wild animal within a few days and resolve the annoying nighttime disturbance. 4 days passed without any success, and the heavy metal animal traps remained completely empty and undisturbed outside. The scratching noises continued to grow louder and more aggressive during the darkest hours of the early morning. Arthur documented how the sounds would often stop abruptly whenever he turned on a lamp or moved around. This cautious behavior struck him as highly unusual for simple rodents or common wild animals seeking winter warmth. He began keeping a heavy steel flashlight near his bed to investigate the walls whenever the scratching started. By the end of the 3rd week, the situation took a distinctly unnerving turn inside the isolated home. Arthur realized the scratching sounds were no longer confined to a single spot near the old stone fireplace. The noises actively tracked his physical movements as he walked slowly across the long wooden bedroom floor at night. He tested this theory by pacing from the window to the door and listening to the corresponding movement. Investigators never confirmed if multiple animals were present, but Arthur firmly believed something was intentionally following his steps. His growing anxiety pushed him to conduct a thorough daylight inspection of the entire property exterior and foundation. He walked around the perimeter with a digital camera and documented several strange markings near the rear entrance. He found deep vertical gouges in the wooden siding located nearly 6 feet above the soft, damp ground. The freshly exposed wood indicated the severe damage had occurred sometime during the previous heavy rainstorm that week. He immediately recognized the alarming height and sheer force required to create such deep markings in solid timber. Arthur contacted the local sheriff department and requested an officer visit the property to document the disturbing vandalism. The responding deputy noted the severe anxiety in Arthur's voice and spent an hour examining the exterior damage. The officer suggested a large black bear standing on its hind legs might be responsible for the gouges. However, a detailed search of the surrounding soft mud revealed absolutely no animal tracks or displaced vegetation anywhere. Arthur politely dismissed the bear theory and pointed out the precise and almost calculated nature of the scratching. The following night, the scratching sounds migrated from the ground floor walls to the ceiling directly above him. Arthur described the noise in his audio logs as heavy objects dragging across the exposed second-floor joists. The farmhouse had a small, unfinished attic space accessible only through a narrow wooden panel in the hallway. He spent hours staring at the ceiling and tracking the slow, methodical movements shifting above his living room. He recorded over 40 minutes of audio, capturing the undeniable sound of heavy weight pressing on the drywall. His Boston contracting firm received a final email from Arthur on the morning of November 22nd. He requested an emergency leave of absence and attached several heavily distorted audio files of the ceiling noises. The firm manager tried calling his cell phone multiple times, but only received automated out-of-service messages. The cellular reception in the deep Aroostook County woods was notoriously unreliable during heavy autumn wind and rainstorms. Arthur was entirely cut off from the outside world while trapped inside the echoing walls of the farmhouse. The strange noises reached a terrifying peak later that evening when a violent thunderstorm hit the rural area. Arthur sat at his kitchen table and recorded a final entry in his personal digital audio journal device. He calmly explained that the scratching had evolved into frantic clawing directly above his primary first-floor bedroom. He noted the structural groaning of the ceiling panels indicated whatever was up there weighed over 200 pounds. He expressed a deep, rational fear that the drywall would eventually collapse under the immense shifting physical weight. Desperation finally forced Arthur to make a second emergency call to the county dispatch center at midnight. He spoke in a harsh whisper and explained that an unknown intruder was currently trapped inside his attic. The dispatcher logged the call and immediately categorized it as an active home invasion requiring an urgent response. Arthur stayed on the phone and provided a highly detailed description of the ongoing frantic clawing sounds above. He explicitly stated the noise did not sound like any animal he had ever encountered in the woods. The audio recording of the emergency call captures the exact moment Arthur made a terrible and fatal decision. He told the dispatcher he was tired of waiting and intended to look through the hallway access panel. The dispatcher repeatedly ordered him to stay inside a locked room and wait for the armed deputies to arrive. Arthur ignored the strict instructions and stated he was simply going to shine his heavy flashlight up there. The call captured the sound of a chair sliding across the floor before disconnecting abruptly into total silence. Multiple law enforcement vehicles arrived at the secluded farmhouse exactly 45 minutes after the dropped emergency call. The heavy rain had washed away any potential footprints on the long gravel driveway leading to the property. They found the front door standing wide open, swinging violently in the harsh wind of the passing storm. Arthur's modified utility truck was still parked outside, and his wallet and keys were sitting on the table. The interior of the house was completely dark, silent, and showed no obvious signs of a physical struggle. Deputies drew their weapons and conducted a slow, tactical sweep of the entire ground floor and exterior perimeter. They found the kitchen and bedroom completely undisturbed, with Arthur's computer still running a structural analysis software program. However, they soon discovered the wooden attic access panel in the central hallway had been pushed completely open. A heavy wooden dining chair was positioned directly underneath the dark rectangular hole leading into the ceiling space. The deputies gathered beneath the opening and called out for Arthur, but received absolutely no verbal response back. One officer climbed onto the chair and slowly raised his tactical flashlight into the pitch-black attic space. He immediately spotted Arthur's heavy steel flashlight slowly rolling across the exposed wooden floorboards near the ventilation shaft. The officer carefully pulled himself into the cramped space and began crawling across the thick pink fiberglass insulation. The air inside the attic was incredibly cold and smelled strongly of decaying damp wood and raw copper. He signaled for backup as he discovered highly disturbing physical evidence scattered around the central load-bearing beam. Records conflict regarding what exactly the investigating officers discovered near the main ventilation shaft at the far end. Some official police reports state the officers found an old, filthy sleeping bag and several empty food cans. This mundane evidence strongly suggested an unknown transient individual had been secretly living directly above Arthur's bedroom. The squatter theory perfectly explained the heavy footsteps, the moving sounds, and the missing food from the kitchen. However, other highly confidential sources from the investigation claimed the physical evidence was much more sinister and ambiguous. A secondary forensic report described finding human fingernails deeply embedded in the wooden beams near the ventilation grate. The report suggested someone had been frantically clawing at the floorboards from inside the attic for several days. This terrifying detail aligned perfectly with Arthur's detailed audio logs describing the desperate scratching sounds above his head. Investigators found long strands of unidentified dark hair snagged on the sharp, rusty nails protruding from the roof. Whatever had been hiding up there had seemingly vanished into the stormy night without leaving a clear trail. The state police immediately launched a massive search effort through the surrounding dense timberland the very next morning. They established a command center at the property and brought in heavily trained tracking dogs to scour the woods. The dogs reportedly lost the scent completely less than 100 yards away from the farmhouse back door. They also utilized thermal imaging helicopters to scan miles of dense forest canopy for any signs of body heat. Despite the massive allocation of resources and manpower, they found absolutely no trace of the missing structural engineer. The property remained heavily scrutinized by forensics teams for the next 14 days without yielding any definitive answers. The deep gouges on the exterior siding were re-examined and matched the exact width of a large human hand. The heavy scratching Arthur heard was undeniably a person physically tearing at the architecture of the isolated house. The identity of the potential squatter and their disturbing motive for tormenting the isolated man remains completely unknown. No fingerprints matching anyone in the National Criminal Database were ever recovered from the dusty attic floorboards. Arthur's abandoned audio journals were eventually transcribed and added to the massive unresolved missing persons case file. Audio experts analyzed the recordings of the ceiling noises, but could not identify any specific spoken words or breathing. The deep, rhythmic thumping captured on the digital device continues to baffle sound engineers and law enforcement officials today. Some analysts suggest the acoustics of the old house amplified the movements of a relatively small person hiding above. Others believe the terrifying recordings capture something much larger, moving with deliberate and malicious intent in the dark. The Boston contracting firm officially terminated Arthur's employment contract 3 months after his mysterious and sudden disappearance. His remaining family members traveled to Maine to collect his personal belongings and abandoned professional surveying equipment. They reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while standing inside the quiet and empty rural farmhouse property. The landlord eventually boarded up the windows and securely padlocked the doors, leaving the building to slowly decay. The property quickly earned a dark reputation among locals who actively avoid driving down that specific dirt road. Years passed, and the dense Maine forest slowly began to reclaim the forgotten farmhouse and the overgrown driveway. Hunters occasionally report hearing strange, rhythmic thumping noises echoing from the direction of the abandoned two-story structure. Some adventurous teenagers broke into the house in 2019, but fled after hearing heavy footsteps upstairs. Police responded to their trespassing call, but found the interior completely empty and the attic access panel sealed shut. The legend of the scratching in the walls continues to grow and terrify the small surrounding rural community. Today, the state records officially list Arthur Pendleton as an active missing person with 0 new leads generated. Investigators never confirmed if he panicked and fled into the freezing woods or was taken by the unknown intruder. The truth regarding what he actually saw when he shined his flashlight into that dark attic remains a mystery. The case serves as a chilling reminder of the deep isolation found in the remote corners of northern Maine. Whoever or whatever was hiding in the ceiling space that cold November night has never been identified or caught. In this new story, you can't outrun the cold in these mountains. The wilderness of the northern Rockies is a place of breathtaking beauty that hides a cruel and indifferent nature. It is a landscape where the weather can turn from a sunny afternoon to a whiteout blizzard in minutes. In the winter of 2023, a seasoned utility contractor named Tobias Craig uncovered a grim mystery in this frozen world. What he found in a remote relay station would eventually explain the disappearance of 2 men who were complete strangers. The official case file describes a tragedy of paranoia and proximity that is almost impossible to believe. The events of that week proved that the most dangerous thing in the forest is not always the cold. Tobias was a man who had spent 40 years working on the high-voltage lines that crisscrossed the state. He was accustomed to the biting wind and the silence that draped over the mountains during the winter months. On a Tuesday in early February, he was assigned a ticket to service the backup generator at the Blackwood Ridge station. The station was a small cabin that housed essential communication equipment and a living space for temporary maintenance crews. It had been occupied for the last 2 weeks by a contract technician named Miles Coven. Miles was supposed to check in with dispatch every morning at 8, but he had missed 2 consecutive calls. The journey up to the ridge was slow and treacherous as Tobias navigated his heavy snowcat over the buried service road. The treads of the machine crunched over the hard-packed snow, and the engine roared against the thin mountain air. Tobias watched the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was still and lifeless under the ice. He reached the summit just after noon, and the station came into view against a backdrop of gray clouds. The first thing he noticed was that the chimney of the cabin was dark and smokeless. The second thing he saw was the heavy steel door of the cabin swinging wildly in the wind. He parked the snowcat near the woodshed and killed the engine to let the silence of the peak wash over him. The only sound was the rhythmic banging of the unlatched door hitting the frame and the whistle of the wind. Tobias grabbed his heavy flashlight and his radio from the passenger seat and stepped out into the freezing air. He walked toward the cabin with a sense of dread pooling in his stomach and called out for Miles. There was no answer from the dark interior of the structure, and the snow on the porch was drifted high. He stepped across the threshold, and the beam of his light cut through the gloom to reveal a chaotic scene. The interior of the cabin was frozen solid, and the temperature inside felt even colder than the air outside. A plate of food sat on the small wooden table, and it was covered in a layer of frost. The wood stove in the corner was cold to the touch, and the ash box was full to the brim. The cot against the wall was unmade, and the sleeping bag was twisted as if someone had left in a hurry. Tobias scanned the room for any sign of a struggle, but the furniture was upright and in its place. It looked as though the occupant had simply vanished in the middle of a meal and left the door wide open. Tobias walked over to the desk where the station logbook lay open next to a portable weather radio. He picked up the book and began to read the entries that Miles had written over the last 2 weeks. The early pages were standard reports on fuel levels and signal strength and the weather conditions on the ridge, but the tone of the writing began to change around the 10th day of the rotation. Miles wrote about hearing strange scratching noises that seemed to come from the walls or the floor at night. He described a feeling of being watched and a sensation of cold drafts that defied the roaring fire. The entries from the final 3 days painted a picture of a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. Miles claimed that food was going missing from the pantry and that his tools were being moved around the room. He wrote that he could hear breathing when the wind died down and that he was afraid to sleep. The final entry was scrawled in a shaky hand and simply said that the intruder was inside the room. Tobias closed the book and looked around the empty cabin with a fresh wave of unease running down his spine. He wondered if the isolation had caused Miles to suffer from a breakdown and flee into the woods. He stepped back out onto the porch and began to circle the cabin to look for footprints in the snow. The wind had scrubbed away most of the surface details, but he found a set of deep indentations near the stairs. The tracks led away from the safety of the cabin and headed directly toward the steep drop of the eastern slope. Tobias followed the trail for 300 yards until he reached the edge of the tree line where the snow was deeper. It was there that he found the body of Miles Kovan partially buried in a drift near a large spruce tree. The discovery was shocking, not just because of the death, but because of the condition of the body. Miles was wearing only a thin thermal shirt and his socks, despite the freezing temperatures of the storm that had passed. His heavy parka and his boots were found 50 feet back up the trail, as if he had discarded them. Tobias knew about the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia causes a victim to feel intensely hot. It seemed like a clear case of a man who had snapped mentally and run out into the cold to die. But something about the scene did not sit right with Tobias as he marked the location with a flag. He returned to the cabin to call in the situation to the sheriff and to secure the site for the coroner. He closed the heavy door and latched it tight before turning his attention back to the cold wood stove. He decided to light a fire to warm the space up while he waited for the authorities to arrive. He knelt on the floor and reached for the kindling box, but stopped when he felt a distinct draft of air. The cold breeze was coming from the floorboards directly in front of the stove where the rug had been kicked aside. Tobias shone his light on the floor and noticed that 2 of the wide pine planks were slightly misaligned. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt and wedged the flat head of the screwdriver between the boards to pry them up. The wood groaned and popped as the nails gave way, and he lifted the section of the floor to reveal a dark space. The smell that drifted up from the hole was a mix of unwashed humanity and stale food that made him gag. He pointed his flashlight into the crawl space and saw a makeshift nest constructed from insulation and stolen blankets. And in the center of the nest was the curled-up body of a second man who was also frozen solid. The investigation that followed in the weeks after the discovery would piece together a story that was stranger than fiction. The man under the floor was identified as a fugitive named Silas Vane, who had been on the run for months. He had broken into the crawl space of the cabin before the winter season began and had been living there in secret. He had survived by siphoning heat from the wood stove above and stealing food when Miles was asleep or outside. He had drilled small holes in the floorboards to let the warmth of the fire filter down into his hiding spot. The scratching noises that Miles had reported in the logbook were likely Silas moving around in the cramped space below. The breathing he heard was the sound of the fugitive sleeping just inches beneath his feet. The missing food and the moved tools were not the result of a haunting, but the desperate acts of a starving man. It became clear that Miles had not been hallucinating, but had been reacting to a very real presence in his home. The tragedy was that he never realized the intruder was a person and not a supernatural force or a delusion. The reconstruction of the final night suggested that Silas had made a mistake and alerted Miles to his presence. Perhaps he had coughed or knocked against the floorboards loud enough to be heard over the wind. Miles had panicked and believed that the monster was finally coming for him, and he had bolted for the door. In his terror, he had run out into the storm without his gear and succumbed to the elements within hours. The open door was the detail that sealed the fate of the man left behind in the crawl space. When Miles ran, he left the door wide open, and the brutal winter wind had rushed into the cabin instantly. The fire in the wood stove would have burned out quickly or been extinguished by the drafting wind. With the heat source gone, the crawl space turned into an icebox within a matter of minutes. Silas was trapped in his narrow hole with no way to exit quickly and no heavy clothing to protect him. He had frozen to death in his hiding spot while the man he had been haunting froze to death in the woods. The medical examiner confirmed that both men had died within hours of each other on that same dark night. The fugitive had been leeching the life and warmth from the technician until the very end. It was a parasitic relationship that ended in mutual destruction when the host finally fled the environment. Tobias often thought about the irony of the two men dying so close to each other, yet so far apart. They had shared the same roof and the same heat source for weeks without ever seeing each other's faces. The cabin at Blackwood Ridge was cleaned out, and the floorboards were replaced, but the story lingered in the local community. The utility company eventually tore the structure down and replaced it with a fully automated system that required no human presence. They said it was for efficiency, but everyone knew it was because no one wanted to work the night shift there. The idea of sleeping in a room where someone might be listening from below was too much to bear. It became a cautionary tale for the new hires about the importance of checking every corner of a remote site. Tobias retired from the field a year later and spent his time fishing in the valleys where the sun stayed warm. He never forgot the image of the nest under the floor and the stolen blankets that made up a bed. It was a stark reminder of how desperate a person can become when they are trying to outrun the law. Silas Vane had thought he found the perfect hiding spot where the snow would cover his tracks forever. He had traded his freedom for a cold grave beneath the floor of a stranger's house. The file on the case was closed, with a ruling of accidental death by hypothermia for both individuals involved. The sheriff remarked that it was a 1-in-a-million situation that would likely never happen again. But for Tobias, the case was not about the odds, but about the fragility of the human mind. Miles Coven had been a rational and capable man who was driven to madness by sounds he could not explain. He had been right about the danger, but wrong about the source, and that mistake cost him his life. The wilderness has a way of stripping away the layers of civilization and revealing the raw instincts of survival. In the end, both men were just animals trying to stay warm in a world that wanted them frozen. The mountains do not care about justice or guilt or the reasons why a man might hide in the dark. They only care about the temperature and the wind and the relentless passage of time. And on that ridge in February, the cold won the race against both the innocent and the guilty. There are still nights when Tobias wakes up and listens to the settling of his own house in the quiet hours. He listens for the scratch of a nail against wood or the soft exhale of a breath that is not his own. He knows that it is just the house cooling down after a long day, but the memory is hard to shake. We all like to believe that we are safe in our homes and that we are alone when we lock the door. But the story of the cabin is a whisper that says we might never truly know what lies beneath the floor. The equipment from the cabin was auctioned off, and the logs were hauled away to be used for firewood in the valley. The only thing that remains on the ridge is a concrete slab that is slowly being reclaimed by the moss. Hikers who pass by the spot often stop to rest and admire the view without knowing what happened there. They sit on the concrete and eat their lunch while the ghost of the station sleeps beneath them. The wind still howls through the trees and tries to tell the story to anyone who will listen. It serves as a grim testament to the fact that fear can be just as deadly as the freezing cold. Miles ran from a fear that he built up in his mind until it became a monster he could not fight. If he had just looked under the rug, he might have found a man instead of a demon. He might have been able to handle an intruder where he could not handle the unknown. But fear is the enemy of reason, and in the isolation of the mountains, reason is the only thing that keeps you alive. The legacy of the discovery is a new protocol for all the rangers and workers who head out to the remote posts. They are now required to inspect the substructures of every building before they settle in for their shift. It is a small change, but one that carries the weight of 2 lives that were lost for nothing. The cold will always be there waiting for a mistake or a moment of weakness. But now, at least the people who work the high lines know to check the floor before they close their eyes. You can never be too careful when you are alone in a place where the nearest help is hours away. The mind plays tricks in the silence, and the shadows can stretch into shapes that look like threats. But sometimes the threat is real, and it is hiding in the one place you never thought to look. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes they give one up to teach us a lesson. And the lesson from Blackwood Ridge is that you can't outrun the cold if you bring it with you. This hospital wing has been sealed off for years. The massive brick structure of St. Jude Medical Center in Detroit, Michigan, dominates the skyline of the surrounding industrial district with its imposing Gothic architecture. The hospital complex was constructed in 1920 and served the community for decades until financial mismanagement forced a partial closure in 2010. The facility remains partially operational today, but the entire eastern wing, known as Ward C, has been strictly off-limits to all personnel. Hospital administration officially stated that the wing was sealed due to severe asbestos contamination and structural instability caused by water damage. However, rumors have persisted among the maintenance staff that the wing still consumes a significant amount of electricity despite being empty. These rumors were largely dismissed as workplace gossip until a private contractor was hired to inspect the ventilation system in October 2023. Michael Vance was a 42-year-old HVAC specialist who had been contracted by the hospital board to map the old ductwork for a renovation project. Vance was a pragmatic man with 20 years of experience in industrial maintenance, and he had no interest in the ghost stories that circulated about the building. He arrived at the hospital on the morning of October 14, 2023, equipped with blueprints that dated back to 1955. His objective was to locate a series of intake vents in Ward C that were reportedly connected to the main boiler room in the active basement. Dispatch logs from the security office show that Vance checked in at 0800 hours and was issued a temporary access badge. The head of security reportedly warned Vance to wear a respirator at all times and to limit his time inside the sealed wing. The entrance to Ward C was located behind a heavy set of double doors on the 3rd floor that had been welded shut years prior. The maintenance crew used an industrial angle grinder to cut through the welds and pry the doors open for the first time in a decade. Vance described the rush of air that escaped the wing as stale and smelling faintly of ozone rather than the expected mold or rot. He stepped into the corridor alone while the maintenance crew remained on the active side of the threshold to secure the equipment. The hallway ahead of him was pitch black, and his flashlight beam cut through the thick clouds of dust that hung in the stagnant air. State records regarding the building code indicate that all power to that section should have been severed in 2011. Vance walked slowly down the main corridor of Ward C, checking the walls for the ventilation shafts marked on his blueprints. The floor was covered in debris and ceiling tiles that had fallen over the years, creating a hazardous obstacle course for the contractor. He noted in his digital voice recorder that the temperature inside the wing was significantly lower than the rest of the hospital. The air felt refrigerated rather than just unheated, which was unusual for a building that had been sealed for so long. He reached the first nurse station, which sat at the intersection of two hallways, and shone his light over the desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, and a landline phone sat off the hook, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. The contractor continued deeper into the wing toward the intensive care unit where the main intake vents were supposedly located. He stopped abruptly when he noticed a light flickering at the far end of the hallway near the double doors of the ICU. The light was a fluorescent tube that was buzzing rhythmically and casting a pale yellow glow on the peeling paint of the walls. Vance was confused because the blueprints clearly showed that the electrical grid for Ward C had been physically disconnected at the breaker box. He approached the light with caution and assumed that perhaps a backup generator had malfunctioned and engaged in error. He reached the doors of the ICU and pushed them open, revealing a scene that contradicted the official narrative of the hospital. The intensive care unit was relatively clean compared to the hallway he had just traversed, and the air smelled sharply of antiseptic chemicals. There was no dust on the floor in this section, and the equipment appeared to be staged as if it were ready for patients. Vance saw a row of heart monitors lined up against the wall and noted that the power indicators on the devices were glowing green. This detail suggested that the equipment was not only plugged in, but was actively drawing current from an unknown source. He felt a sudden unease and checked his radio to contact the security team, but found that the signal was dead. He decided to document the anomaly with his phone camera before finishing his survey of the vents. Vance moved into one of the patient rooms to inspect a vent cover located near the ceiling and set his tool bag on the bed. The bed was made with crisp white linens that looked fresh and did not show the yellowing signs of age or neglect. He climbed his ladder and removed the vent cover to peer inside the shaft with his flashlight. The beam of light revealed that the ductwork was free of dust and appeared to have been recently cleaned or replaced. He climbed down from the ladder and noticed a clipboard hanging on the foot of the bed that he had missed earlier. He picked up the clipboard and read the patient chart attached to it, which contained a series of dates and medical codes. The dates entered on the chart were from September and October of 2023, which was impossible given the status of the wing. The notes described a male patient aged 50 who was undergoing experimental treatment for a degenerative neurological condition. The handwriting was messy but legible, and the signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor who was not listed in the current staff directory. Vance felt a wave of panic as he realized that the wing was not abandoned, but was being used for something off the books. He dropped the clipboard on the bed and grabbed his tool bag with the intention of leaving the area immediately. A loud mechanical hum suddenly started up from the room next door, causing the floor to vibrate beneath his boots. The sound was consistent with a heavy-duty air filtration system or a large compressor turning on at full power. Vance stepped out into the hallway and saw that the lights in the other patient rooms were now flickering on one by one. The corridor was illuminated in a strobe effect that made the shadows jump and twist in disorienting patterns. He heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching from the direction of the nurse station he had passed earlier. The footsteps were heavy and purposeful sounding, like hard-soled shoes striking the linoleum floor. Vance sprinted toward the emergency exit at the end of the ICU. Ward, hoping that the push bar would still function. He reached the emergency exit and slammed his body weight against the bar, but the door refused to budge. He looked closely at the frame and saw that it had been screwed shut from the outside with heavy-duty lag bolts. The footsteps were getting closer, and Vance looked around for a place to hide or a weapon to defend himself. He ducked into a supply closet and pulled the door shut, leaving only a small crack to see into the hallway. A figure walked past the closet door wearing a full hazmat suit with a powered air-purifying respirator. The person in the suit was pushing a gurney that carried a shape covered by a thick rubber sheet. Vance held his breath and watched as the figure stopped in front of the room he had just vacated. The person entered the room and Vance heard the sound of the clipboard being picked up and placed back on the hook. The figure then exited the room and continued down the hall, pushing the gurney toward the operating theater. Vance waited until the sound of the wheels faded into the distance before he burst out of the closet. He ran back the way he came, sprinting through the clean section and back into the dusty corridor. He did not stop running until he reached the welded doors where the maintenance crew was waiting. The crew looked at him with confusion as he scrambled through the opening, covered in sweat and dust. The security team detained Vance immediately and escorted him to a small office on the administrative floor. He tried to explain what he had seen, but the head of security interrupted him and told him he was hallucinating due to toxic fumes. They confiscated his phone and deleted the photos he had taken, citing patient privacy laws, despite the wing being closed. Vance was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement that threatened severe legal action if he spoke about the layout of the hospital. He was escorted off the property by 2 armed guards and told that his contract was terminated effective immediately. The hospital administration later issued a statement claiming that Vance had suffered a panic attack triggered by claustrophobia. Vance filed a report with the local police department the following day, claiming that he had witnessed illegal activity in the hospital. The police investigated the claim and sent a pair of officers to inspect Ward C with the hospital administrator. The officers reported that the wing was completely dark and filled with debris, just as the hospital had stated. They found no evidence of power or clean linens, and the ICU was stripped bare of all equipment. The police report concluded that there was no merit to the allegations and closed the case. Vance insisted that they had cleaned the scene overnight or that he had been in a different section of the building. A review of the hospital utility records from 2023 shows a discrepancy in the power consumption for the main campus. The records indicate a spike in usage every night between the hours of 0200 and 0500. This usage pattern is consistent with the operation of high-energy medical imaging equipment like MRI machines. The hospital claims this is due to the automated sterilization cycles of the laundry department in the basement. However, the laundry department is not on the same circuit as the sealed eastern wing. This technical inconsistency has never been explained by the facility management team. Some locals who live in the apartments facing the east side of the hospital have reported seeing lights in the windows of Ward C. These witnesses claim that the lights are often accompanied by the arrival of unmarked vans at the delivery dock. A resident named Sarah Miller told a local journalist that she saw a figure standing in the window of the 4th floor on Halloween night. The figure appeared to be wearing a surgical mask and was looking down at the street with a pair of binoculars. The journalist attempted to publish the story, but the editor killed the piece, citing a lack of corroborating evidence. The apartments have a direct line of sight to the rooms where Vance found the clean bed. Vance struggled to find work in the city after the incident, as rumors of his instability spread among contractors. He eventually moved to Ohio to work for a residential heating company and tried to put the event behind him. He told his wife that he sometimes wakes up to the sound of rhythmic beeping like a heart monitor. Medical records from 2024 show that Vance developed a chronic respiratory condition shortly after the inspection. His doctor noted that his lungs showed signs of exposure to a rare chemical used in industrial sterilization. Vance believes this is proof that the air in the wing was being treated for a sterile environment. The hospital announced plans to demolish the eastern wing in 2025 to make room for a new parking structure. The demolition was scheduled to be carried out by a specialized team from out of state. During the demolition prep, a worker was injured when a pressurized oxygen line ruptured in the wall. The existence of a pressurized line in a building that was supposedly disconnected for a decade raised more questions. The fire department response log notes that the line was still connected to a central manifold that was hidden behind a false wall in the basement. The hospital stated it was a remnant of the old system that had not been properly purged. Investigators never confirmed the source of the oxygen or who was paying for the electricity in the sealed wing. The debris from the demolition was hauled away in sealed trucks to a hazardous waste landfill. The space where Ward C stood is now a flat concrete lot used for visitor parking. The truth of what Vance saw that day remains buried under layers of conflicting paperwork and corporate denial. The only physical evidence that remains is the scarring on Vance's lungs and the utility bills that don't add up. The city of Detroit has many abandoned buildings, but few are guarded as jealously as the ruin of Ward C was. In this new story, what happened inside this frozen Appalachian cabin will shock you. The dense forests of the Appalachian mountain range are known for swallowing secrets and hiding them under layers of heavy winter snow. This story examines the official case file of a missing person and the disturbing evidence found inside his isolated home. Silas Thorne was a 62-year-old man who had spent his entire adult life working near the timberline. He served as a fire lookout for 30 years and chose to retire in a cabin built on the Devil Ridge. The local rangers described Silas as a man of extreme discipline who kept his living quarters in a state of military order. On the morning of January 4th, 2022, a massive low-pressure system collided with the mountain peaks. Meteorologists predicted that the storm would bring wind chills of 40 degrees below zero and nearly 5 feet of snow. Silas contacted the dispatch tower at 8 in the morning to confirm he was hiking down to the main trailhead. He told the operator that his radio batteries were draining unusually fast, and he wanted to get below the storm line. The dispatch logs show that the operator advised Silas to stay inside the cabin if the visibility dropped below 50 yards. Silas replied that he could already see the clouds descending, and he signed off with his standard call sign and code. That was the last time anyone heard a human voice transmit from the cabin on the top of Devil Ridge. The storm raged for 9 straight days and buried the access roads under drifts that were impossible for trucks to pass. A supply driver named Arthur Vance waited at the bottom of the trail for 2 hours on that first Tuesday afternoon. Arthur stated in his police report that the woods were silent and he felt a strange pressure in his ears. He honked his horn several times, but the sound seemed to be absorbed by the thick white mist falling from above. Arthur eventually returned to the town and filed a missing person report with the county sheriff the very next morning. The authorities could not launch a rescue mission until the weather system finally broke on the 14th of January. A specialized search and rescue team was assembled at dawn, and they used heavy snowmobiles to navigate the buried logging roads. The team was led by a veteran ranger named Miller, who had known Silas personally for more than 20 years. They reached the base of the ridge around noon and had to proceed on foot using snowshoes and climbing gear. Miller later wrote in his official incident report that the forest around the cabin looked different than the rest of the mountain. The bark on the pine trees had been stripped away on the side facing the cabin as if blasted by sand. The cabin itself stood dark against the white snow, and the front door was standing wide open to the freezing wind. Miller signaled for his team to hold their positions while he approached the porch with his weapon drawn and ready. He shouted for Silas, but the only sound was the wind whistling through the open doorway and into the dark interior. The team entered the structure and found the main room buried under 3 feet of fine and powdery-driven snow. They expected to find the frozen body of Silas Thorne somewhere in the drift, but the room appeared to be empty. Investigating officers began to clear the snow carefully to avoid disturbing any potential evidence that might be hidden on the floor. They uncovered the kitchen table and found a scene that suggested Silas had been interrupted in the middle of a routine. A bowl of beef stew sat on the table, and the liquid was frozen into a solid block of brown ice. A metal spoon was resting in the bowl, but the handle was bent backward at a complete 90-degree angle. Miller noted that it would take significant force to bend a piece of steel cutlery in such a precise manner. The team continued their sweep of the small living space and found Silas's heavy winter coat hanging on the wall hook. His insulated boots were sitting on the stone hearth of the fireplace, and they were dry and cold to the touch. This discovery immediately escalated the concern of the team because no experienced woodsman would leave without his gear in a storm. The temperature inside the cabin was 5 degrees below zero, and survival time without protective clothing would be measured in minutes. A junior deputy named Kowalski found a spiral notebook sitting on the nightstand next to the narrow bed in the corner. The notebook contained the daily weather logs that Silas kept as a habit from his days as a professional fire lookout. The handwriting in the first half of the book was neat and precise, with clear notations of wind speed and temperature. The entries for the final week showed a marked deterioration in the penmanship, and the sentences became difficult to read. On January 2nd, Silas wrote that the birds had stopped singing and the forest had gone completely silent in the afternoon. The entry for January 3rd described a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate the floorboards of the cabin all night. Silas wrote that the sound was making his teeth ache and he could feel the fillings in his molars vibrating. The final written entry was scrawled on the morning of his disappearance, and it simply said, "The light is wrong today." Kowalski bagged the notebook as evidence and continued to search the area around the bed for any other personal items. He looked under the bed frame and discovered a small handheld digital audio recorder that was covered in a layer of dust. The device was powered off, but the batteries still held enough charge to play back the files stored on the memory. Miller gathered the team in the center of the room and pressed the play button to listen to the final logs. The first file was dated January 3rd and captured the sound of Silas pacing back and forth on the wooden floor. He spoke into the microphone and said he was recording this because he did not trust his own eyes anymore. Silas described seeing shapes moving in the tree line that looked like tall, pale men standing perfectly still in the snow. He said they were too tall to be human and their arms hung down past their knees in an unnatural way. The recording picked up a low-frequency thrumming noise that caused the speaker on the digital recorder to crackle and distort. The second audio file was recorded at 3 in the morning on the day Silas was supposed to hike down. The voice on the tape was barely a whisper, and Silas sounded like he was hiding in the corner of the room. He said the visitors were on the porch and he could hear them running their fingernails along the exterior siding. The recorder captured a sharp scratching sound that moved from the left side of the stereo field to the right side. It sounded like hard ceramic dragging against soft wood, and it continued for nearly 4 minutes without any pause or rhythm. Silas whispered that the thermal glass in the windows was vibrating, and he could see a blue light seeping through the cracks. He said the light did not cast any shadows, and it made the air inside the cabin smell like burning ozone. The team listened in silence as the scratching on the tape suddenly stopped and was replaced by a heavy thudding on the roof. The sound was heavy enough to shake the dust from the rafters, and it sounded like something massive had landed above. Silas let out a shaky breath and said they were trying to come down the chimney to get inside the room. The final recording was only 10 seconds long, and the timestamp showed it was made just minutes before the scheduled radio call. The audio was filled with the sound of the wind roaring, but the door sounded like it was being ripped open. Silas shouted one final word that sounded like clay before the recording cut to static and the device turned itself off. Miller ordered the team to inspect the fireplace and the chimney based on the terrifying commentary from the audio logs. The hearth was cold and the flue was closed, but the team noticed a strange gray substance leaking from the damper. They used a crowbar to pry open the iron damper, and a massive amount of wet gray mud spilled into the room. The mud was heavy and smelled distinctly of stagnant water and decaying plant matter from the bottom of a riverbed. The team collected samples of the mud and later sent them to the state crime lab for a detailed geological analysis. The lab results confirmed that the mud was a specific type of sedimentary clay found only at the bottom of the Valley River. This river was located 5 miles away and 2,000 feet down the steep cliff from where the cabin stood. The river had been frozen solid under 18 inches of ice for the entire month leading up to the disappearance. There was no logical way for hundreds of pounds of wet river bottom clay to end up inside a chimney on the ridge. The forensic team also processed the interior of the cabin for fingerprints and DNA evidence that might explain the intruder. They found no foreign DNA in the cabin, and the only fingerprints belonged to Silas Thorne and the rescue team members. However, the team found a series of disturbing marks on the wooden ceiling beams directly above the center of the room. The marks were indentations in the wood that looked like they were made by human hands pressing upward with immense pressure. The size of the hands was significantly larger than an average human, and the fingers were long and incredibly thin. The pressure required to make such marks in solid pine beams would exceed the strength of any living person or animal. The team also noted that there were no ladder marks or furniture scratches on the floor beneath the ceiling prints. It was as if someone or something had floated up to the ceiling and pressed against the wood with crushing force. The investigation expanded to include a review of historical cases in the same sector of the National Forest Archives. A junior archivist discovered a dusty file from 1972 involving another lookout named Edward Haynes. Edward had vanished from a tower less than a mile from where Silas Thorne lived, and the details were strikingly similar. The report from 1972 stated that Edward's tower was found with the door open and the radio smashed. The investigating sheriff at the time noted the presence of wet gray mud smeared on the windows and the floor of the tower. Edward was never found, and the case was closed as an accidental death due to exposure to the elements. Another file from 1954 described a team of loggers who abandoned their camp on the Devil Ridge overnight. The foreman claimed that the woods became too quiet, and he saw blue lights floating in the trees near the camp. He reported that his men started acting strange and hearing voices calling their names from the darkness of the heavy timber. The logging company dismissed the crew, and the camp was reclaimed by the forest and eventually rotted away into the ground. The search for Silas Thorne continued for 3 weeks with the help of cadaver dogs and aerial drones with thermal cameras. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led from the cabin door to the edge of the steep cliff face. The trail ended abruptly at the precipice, as if Silas had simply stepped off into the empty air of the canyon. The drones scanned the valley floor and the frozen river below, but found no sign of a body or any clothing. The medical examiner suggested that the extreme cold and the scavenging animals would leave very little evidence after so much time. However, the lack of any physical trace left the family and the community with no closure and many unanswered questions. The official conclusion was that Silas suffered a mental break and wandered into the storm, where he succumbed to hypothermia. The strange evidence of the clay and the bent spoon was omitted from the final public statement to avoid panic. The cabin on Devil Ridge was boarded up by the Forest Service, and the trail leading to it was officially closed. Hikers who trespass in that area often report feeling a sudden drop in temperature even during the summer months. Some witnesses claim to see a figure standing on the edge of the cliff, watching them with a dark and intense stare. A group of campers in 2023 reported hearing a digital voice recorder clicking on and off in the woods. They said the voice sounded like an old man reading weather coordinates and warning them to stay away from the trees. The Forest Service has denied these reports and insists that the area is safe, but they refuse to reopen the trail. The mystery of the frozen cabin remains one of the most baffling cold cases in the history of the region. The combination of the audio tapes and the physical impossibility of the clay suggests something far stranger than a storm. The mountain has a way of keeping its own counsel, and silence is often the only answer it gives to our questions. Silas Thorne spent his life watching the forest, and in the end, the forest decided to watch him back. The empty cabin stands as a monument to the things we do not understand and the boundaries we should not cross. The files on the desk of the sheriff are now collecting dust, but the story of the blue lights persists in the valley. Locals advise visitors to stay on the main roads and never to answer if they hear their name called in the woods. The legend of the Clayman has become a cautionary tale for children who want to play too deep in the forest. It serves as a grim reminder that civilization is just a thin shell that protects us from the wild and the unknown. When the wind blows from the north, you can hear the timber groaning under the weight of the snow and the history. The truth of what happened to Silas Thorne is likely frozen somewhere in the ice of the river or the heart of the mountain. We may never know what walked onto that porch or why it left the door open for the snow to enter. All we have are the recordings of a man who was brave enough to stay at his post until the very end. The final voicemail she left remains a mystery. The dense coniferous forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state are known for their breathtaking beauty and their oppressive isolation during the winter months. Clara Mitchell was a 29-year-old freelance architect based in Seattle who specialized in designing sustainable off-grid housing. She had rented a remote cabin near the Hoh Rainforest for a 10-day solo retreat starting on November 10, 2023. Her objective was to finalize the blueprints for a major client without the distractions of the city and to hike the local trails for inspiration. Clara was an experienced outdoorswoman who had hiked portions of the Pacific Crest Trail and was known by her friends as cautious and highly prepared. Dispatch logs from the Jefferson County Sheriff Office confirmed that she arrived at the rental property on schedule and checked in with the property management company via a landline application. The cabin was located 5 miles down a private gravel road that was prone to washing out during heavy rains. The rental property was a 2-story A-frame structure built in the late 70s that sat on a bluff overlooking a dense valley of hemlock and cedar trees. It was equipped with a satellite internet connection and a backup generator, but cell service in the area was notoriously spotty. Clara established a routine during her first 4 days, which involved working on her laptop in the mornings and hiking in the afternoons before the sunset. She communicated daily with her younger brother David, who lived in Portland, ensuring him that she was safe and productive. David later provided investigators with screenshots of their text messages, which showed Clara in high spirits, sending photos of the foggy landscape. The weather reports for the region indicate that a severe storm front moved in on the evening of November 14th, bringing 60-mile-per-hour winds and torrential downpours. The last confirmed text message from Clara was sent at 1945 hours that night, stating that the power was flickering. The storm intensified throughout the night of the 14th and continued into the following morning, knocking out power lines and blocking several access roads with fallen timber. David attempted to call Clara on the morning of November 15th, but his calls went straight to voicemail, which he assumed was due to the weather. He was not immediately alarmed because Clara had warned him that the satellite connection might go down during the storm. However, his concern grew when 24 hours passed without any word from his sister. He contacted the property management firm on the afternoon of November 16th and asked them to perform a welfare check on the cabin. The management company stated that they could not send a caretaker out until the county road crews had cleared the debris from the main highway. State records show that the road was not deemed passable until the morning of November 17th. David received a voicemail from Clara's number at exactly 3:42 in the morning on November 17th while he was asleep. He did not see the notification until he woke up at 6 in the morning and saw the missed call on his screen. The voicemail was 45 seconds long, and the audio quality was heavily distorted by static and digital compression artifacts. David listened to the message and was immediately struck by the tone of Clara's voice, which sounded breathless and terrified. She was whispering urgently into the microphone, and the background noise suggested she was outside in the wind. The transcript of the voicemail, which was later analyzed by audio forensic experts, contains several disjointed phrases that have never been fully explained. Clara can be heard saying they are on the roof, followed by a sound that resembles metal dragging across wet pavement. The most disturbing part of the voicemail occurs at the 20-second mark, when Clara suddenly stops whispering and goes silent for 10 seconds. The silence is broken by a loud mechanical thrumming sound that vibrates the microphone diaphragm, causing the audio to clip. Clara then speaks her final words, which were transcribed as, "Don't let them inside," before the call abruptly disconnects. David called the Jefferson County Sheriff Office immediately after hearing the message and reported his sister as a missing person in distress. He forwarded the voicemail file to the dispatch center and drove 4 hours north to the peninsula to join the search. Deputies arrived at the cabin at 10:30 in the morning on November 17th, finding the gate to the private road open. The responding officers approached the cabin with caution and noted that Clara's Subaru Outback was parked in the driveway, covered in a layer of pine needles. The vehicle was locked, and her purse, along with her wallet and keys, were found on the passenger seat. This discovery immediately escalated the situation because it suggested that Clara had not left the property in her vehicle. The officers found the front door of the cabin locked and had to use a master key provided by the management company to gain entry. The interior of the cabin was dark and cold as the heating system had shut down when the propane tank ran empty. Investigators found a half-eaten meal of pasta on the dining table, which had begun to mold, indicating it had been sitting there for days. There were no signs of a struggle in the main living area, and Clara's laptop was open on the coffee table. A search of the upstairs sleeping loft revealed that the bed had been slept in, but the sheets were tangled as if someone had exited in a hurry. The window facing the rear of the property was unlatched and slightly open, allowing rain to soak the carpet near the sill. Deputies found a single muddy boot print on the floor directly beneath the window, but the tread did not match any of the footwear Clara owned. The print was photographed and measured, but it was too smeared to provide a definitive shoe size or brand. The investigators then swept the exterior of the cabin and found that the crawlspace access panel had been removed and was lying in the mud. A flashlight beam directed into the crawlspace revealed nothing but damp earth and insulation hanging from the floor joists. The timeline of the voicemail became the central focus of the investigation because it contradicted the physical evidence found at the scene. The medical examiner who later consulted on the case estimated that the pasta on the table had been cooked on the evening of November 14th. This suggested that whatever happened to Clara took place 3 days before the voicemail was sent to David. Technical analysis of the cell tower data revealed that Clara's phone had pinged a tower 12 miles away from the cabin at the time the call was made. This tower was located on the other side of a steep ridge that was inaccessible by vehicle. The triangulation data placed the phone deep within a ravine that was known for its treacherous terrain and lack of hiking trails. Search and rescue teams were deployed to the ravine coordinates on November 18th using cadaver dogs and drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The terrain was incredibly difficult to navigate due to the dense undergrowth and the slippery mud caused by the recent storm. The team searched for 3 days without finding any trace of Clara or her clothing. On the 4th day of the search, a volunteer found a shattered smartphone lying on a mossy rock near a creek bed. The phone was confirmed to be Clara's device, but it had been smashed with significant force. The battery had been ejected and was found 10 feet away, submerged in the water. The damage to the phone made it impossible to retrieve any local data, but the SIM card was intact. The recovery of the phone raised a baffling technical question for the investigators and the telecommunications experts. If the phone was smashed and the battery was ejected, it should have been impossible for it to make a call. However, the call log from the service provider clearly showed an outbound call to David's number at 3:42 in the morning on November 17th. Experts suggested that the phone might have been destroyed after the call was made, but the location of the debris field suggested it had been there for days. Another theory proposed was that the call data was delayed due to the network outage and the voicemail was actually recorded days earlier. However, the metadata on the voicemail file itself was timestamped to the 17th, which ruled out a network delay. The audio of the voicemail was sent to a private lab for enhancement to isolate the background noises. The lab report stated that the mechanical thrumming sound was consistent with a large industrial fan or a turbine engine. This finding was perplexing because there were no industrial facilities or wind turbines within a 50-mile radius of the cabin. The sound of metal dragging was analyzed and determined to be consistent with a heavy chain being pulled over stone. David became obsessed with the audio and claimed that he could hear a second voice in the background if he turned the volume up. He insisted that right before the call ended, a deep voice whispered the word "open," but the official police transcript lists this as inconclusive static. Detectives interviewed the maintenance worker who had serviced the cabin's generator 2 weeks prior to Clara's arrival. The man was a 50-year-old local resident with a history of minor theft charges. He provided an alibi, stating that he was at a bar in Port Angeles on the night of the 14th, and his presence was corroborated by credit card receipts. However, a witness who lived on the main road reported seeing a gray van matching the worker's vehicle turning onto the private road on November 16th. The maintenance worker denied returning to the property and claimed the witness was mistaken about the date. Police searched his vehicle and home, but found no physical evidence linking him to Clara's disappearance. The investigation stalled in early 2024 due to a lack of actionable leads and the deteriorating weather conditions in the mountains. The case was classified as a missing person with suspicious circumstances, but no homicide warrant was ever issued. The prevailing theory among law enforcement was that Clara had suffered a mental health crisis or a medical emergency that caused her to wander into the woods. They theorized that she might have survived in the ravine for several days before succumbing to hypothermia. This theory, however, failed to explain the muddy boot print in the loft or the impossible timing of the phone call. The family hired a private investigator to continue the search, but the trail had gone cold. Some locals in the area have long shared stories about the ridge where the phone was found, calling it a place where the sound carries in strange ways. There are archived reports from the 1990s of hikers hearing mechanical grinding noises in that specific valley. Geologists have surveyed the area and found no seismic activity or underground caverns that would account for such acoustic anomalies. The unexplained sounds on the voicemail have fueled internet speculation but provided no comfort to the family. David continues to listen to the voicemail, hoping to decipher a clue that everyone else has missed. He believes that Clara was running from someone or something that night, and that the phone was planted in the ravine to mislead the search parties. The cabin remains a rental property, but the management company has installed bars on the lower windows and upgraded the security system. Renters who have stayed there since the incident have reported no unusual activity other than the occasional power outage. The mystery of how a dead phone could make a call and who made the muddy boot print in the loft remains unsolved. The file on Clara Mitchell sits in a box in the county archives, filled with conflicting data points and unanswered questions. The final voicemail she left stands as the only testament to her last moments in the dark, rainy woods. To this day, no remains have ever been found, and the forest has kept it secret. In this news story, no clues left behind except this frozen photo. The glaciers of the remote Alaskan wilderness are moving vaults that swallow secrets and keep them hidden for decades. These rivers of ice are constantly shifting and grinding against the granite bedrock that lies deep beneath the surface. It is a landscape where the weather can turn fatal in minutes, and mistakes are often punished with death. In the summer of 2024, a glacial surveyor named Kellen Moss made a discovery that was truly chilling. He found an item that had been lost in the ice for over 2 years during a routine survey. This small object would reopen a cold case that the local authorities had declared closed and accidental. The events of that week would prove that the ice does not forget what happens on its frozen slopes. Kellen was a man of 45 who had spent most of his adult life working in the high country. He was employed by a state university to monitor the recession rates of the ice shelves in the sector. His work was solitary and required him to hike miles into the backcountry with a heavy pack of equipment. On a Tuesday in late August, he was traversing the lower tongue of the Black Ridge Glacier. The summer melt had been particularly aggressive that year and had exposed layers of ice that were usually buried. He was drilling a new ablation stake into the surface when a flash of red caught his eye. He stopped his work and walked over to the anomaly that was sitting at the bottom of a meltwater channel. The object was partially encased in the blue ice, but the bright red color stood out against the gray silt. Kellen used his ice axe to carefully chip away the surrounding material until he could pull the item free. It was a heavy-duty waterproof camera case that was attached to a frayed nylon strap. The case was scratched and battered from its journey through the glacier, but the seal appeared to remain intact. He turned it over in his gloved hands and wondered who had lost such an expensive piece of gear. He knew the history of the area well and remembered the names of every person who had gone missing there. 2 years prior, a couple named Senna Ryle and Derek Hart had vanished while attempting a summit of the ridge. The official report stated that they had likely fallen into a crevasse during a sudden whiteout storm in September. Their bodies were never recovered despite a massive search operation that lasted for nearly 2 weeks that autumn. Kellen looked at the camera case and felt a heavy weight settle in his stomach as he recognized the brand. It was the same model that was listed on the missing person flyer that still hung in the town. He finished his work for the day and hiked the 6 miles back to his truck with the camera in his pack. The drive back to his cabin was long and gave him plenty of time to think about the ethical implications. He knew he should turn the camera over to the police immediately, but his curiosity was a powerful force. The local sheriff was a man named Officer Haddon, who had led the search for the missing couple. Haddon was known for being dismissive of new evidence and had been eager to close the case quickly. Kellen decided he would check the memory card first to see if it was actually relevant to the case. He reached his cabin and set up a workspace on his kitchen table with a towel and a bowl of rice. He opened the camera case and found that the interior was perfectly dry thanks to the rubber O-ring seal. The camera itself looked brand new and the battery still held a small charge when he pressed the power button. He removed the memory card and inserted it into the card reader on his laptop with a shaking hand. The computer chimed to indicate that the drive was recognized, and a folder of images appeared on the screen. There were over 400 photos on the card, and the dates went back to the summer of 2022. Kellen began to scroll through the images and felt like he was intruding on the private lives of ghosts. The early photos showed the couple laughing and cooking food at their campsite near the base of the mountain. They looked happy and confident and completely unaware of the fate that was waiting for them on the high ice. The scenery in the background was breathtaking, and the weather looked clear and stable for the first few days. The timestamps on the files confirmed that they had started their climb on September the 10th as planned. The photos from the climb showed them making good progress up the eastern face of the ridge. The mood of the photos changed on the third day of the trip as the clouds began to gather overhead. The lighting became flat and gray, and the smiles on their faces were replaced by looks of concern and fatigue. There were shots of the storm moving in and the visibility dropping to near zero in a matter of minutes. The couple had set up an emergency bivouac on a narrow ledge to wait out the worst of the weather. There were several videos included in the files that showed the wind whipping the tent fabric violently. Senna spoke to the camera in one clip and said they were cold, but they were going to stay put. Kellen watched the videos with a growing sense of dread as the timeline moved closer to their disappearance. The storm raged for 2 days in the photos, and the snow began to pile up around their small shelter. Then the weather cleared on the morning of the 5th day, and the sun came out bright and strong. This was a detail that confused Kellen because the official report said the storm lasted for a full week. The police had claimed that the search was delayed because the weather never broke long enough to fly a helicopter. But the photos on the screen clearly showed blue skies and calm conditions on the morning of September 15th. He continued to click through the images and saw that the couple had packed up their camp and started to descend. They looked exhausted and cold, but they were moving under their own power and the terrain looked navigable. The photos showed them reaching the lower glacier, where the terrain flattened out and the danger of falling decreased. This was the area where they should have been easily spotted by an aerial search team or a ground patrol. The fact that they were never seen began to make less sense with every photo that Kellen viewed. The final sequence of photos on the card was taken near the edge of the tree line later that same afternoon. Senna had taken several shots of the landscape and the retreating glacier tongue that Kellen knew so well. But it was the very last photo on the roll that made Kellen stop and lean closer to the monitor. It was a picture taken by accident, as if the camera had been fired from the hip or dropped. The angle was low and tilted, and the focus was slightly blurry on the foreground elements. The photo showed Derek standing with his hands raised in the air and a look of confusion on his face. He was looking at someone who was standing just out of the frame to the right side of the image. In the bottom right corner of the picture, there was a boot and a pant leg visible. The pant leg was a distinct shade of dark green that was the standard issue uniform for the Forest Service. But it was the boot that caught Kellen's attention because it had a very specific custom modification. There was a metal cleat plate screwed into the heel, which was something only old-school loggers used. Kellen sat back in his chair and tried to process what he was seeing on the screen in front of him. The official story was that no rescue personnel had been in that sector on that specific day. Officer Haddon had stated on the record that his teams were grounded due to zero visibility at the time, yet here was a photo of clear weather and a person in a uniform confronting the missing hikers. And the boot with the heel cleat was a detail that Kellen had seen before in town. He had seen Officer Haddon wearing those exact same boots at the diner just a few days ago. The implication was terrifying because it suggested that Haddon had found the couple and had done something other than rescue them. Kellen copied the files to a secure cloud drive and also to a separate flash drive that he hid. He knew he could not go to the local police with this evidence if the sheriff was involved. He decided he needed to gather more information about the search timeline before he contacted the state troopers. He spent the next day at the public library scrolling through the archives of the local newspaper. He found the articles from September of 2022 and read the quotes from Sheriff Haddon carefully. Haddon claimed that he had personally flown over the area on the 15th and saw nothing but whiteout conditions. He said that the storm was so severe that no one could have survived on the ridge for that long. The lie was blatant when compared to the time-stamped photos of the blue sky and the calm winds. Kellen wondered why a respected lawman would lie about the weather and leave 2 people to die. He dug deeper into the history of the area and found a news story from the year prior to the disappearance. It was a short piece about a proposed mining operation that was trying to get a permit for the valley. The permit was denied because the land was protected habitat and the presence of hikers was a key factor. If the area was deemed too dangerous for public use, then the protected status could be challenged in court. A tragedy involving dead hikers would be the perfect excuse to close the trail and open the land to industry. And the article mentioned that Sheriff Haddon's brother was the foreman for the mining company involved. Kellen realized that the couple had not just fallen into a crack in the ice by accident. They had walked into a conspiracy that was worth millions of dollars to the people involved in the deal. They had survived the storm and made it down the mountain only to be intercepted by the man who was supposed to save them. The photo of the boot was the smoking gun that proved Haddon was at the scene when he said he was miles away. The camera must have been dropped or thrown into the glacial stream during the confrontation that followed. The realization made Kellen paranoid, and he started to watch the road outside his cabin for any strange cars. He knew that Haddon was a powerful man in the small community and had eyes and ears everywhere. He decided he had to leave town and take the evidence to the FBI field office in Anchorage. He packed a bag quickly and hid the camera and the flash drive in the spare tire well of his truck. He waited until nightfall to leave and took the back roads that wound through the dense forest. As he drove down the dark highway, he noticed headlights appear in his rearview mirror and stay there. He sped up and the car behind him matched his speed and stayed right on his bumper. Kellen felt his heart racing as he realized that he might have been watched since he found the camera. He took a sharp turn onto a logging road that he knew connected to the main interstate miles away. The car behind him followed, and he saw the red and blue lights of a police cruiser flash to life. It was Haddon, and he was trying to pull him over in the middle of nowhere. Kellen knew that if he stopped on this dark road, he would likely disappear, just like Senna and Derek. He floored the gas pedal and his truck fishtailed on the gravel as he raced toward the highway. The cruiser was faster and began to close the gap as the road narrowed near a canyon bridge. Kellen saw the lights of a semi-truck passing on the highway just a half-mile ahead. He leaned on his horn and flashed his high beams, hoping to attract the attention of the truck driver. The cruiser bumped his rear bumper and tried to spin him out into the ditch. Kellen fought the steering wheel and managed to keep the truck on the road as he reached the intersection. He skidded out onto the pavement right in front of the semi-truck, which blared its horn loudly. The police cruiser had to slam on its brakes to avoid hitting the truck and spun out into the median. Kellen did not stop driving until he reached the lights of the city and the safety of the federal building. He walked into the FBI office at 3 a.m. and placed the memory card on the desk. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal for the local authorities who had covered up the crime. The federal agents used the metadata from the photos to pinpoint the exact location of the confrontation. They searched the area near the tree line and found bullet casings that matched the service weapon of the sheriff. They also subpoenaed the phone records of Haddon and found he was in the valley on that day. The mining connection was exposed, and the entire scheme to close the trail unraveled in the press. Sheriff Haddon was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. He eventually cut a deal and led the authorities to the location where he had buried the bodies. They were found just a few hundred yards from where the camera had been dropped in the stream. The camera had been washed into a crevasse by the meltwater and carried down the mountain by the ice. It had taken 2 years for the glacier to cough up the evidence that would convict a killer. The town was in shock as the details of the corruption and the murder came to light. The people who had trusted Haddon felt betrayed, and the mining project was permanently canceled. The trail was renamed in honor of Senna and Derek, and a plaque was placed at the trailhead. Kellen was praised for his courage, but he found that he could no longer look at the mountains the same way. He transferred to a university in the lower 48 states and left the ice behind. But he kept a copy of that final photo on his computer as a reminder of what he had found. It was a blurry image of a boot and a hand and a look of confusion that would last forever. It taught him that the wilderness is indifferent, but the people who walk it are not always so neutral. The ice had preserved the truth when everyone else was willing to let it be buried and forgotten. And sometimes the most important clue is the one that was never meant to be seen. The frozen photo serves as a testament to the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect crime in nature. The Earth has a way of keeping score, and eventually it will settle the debt. Senna and Derek did not make it home, but their story was told because of a piece of plastic and silicon. The technology survived the freeze and the thaw and the crushing weight of the glacier. It was a small miracle that brought justice to a dark corner of the world. Years later, hikers still talk about the case when they sit around the fire at the base of the ridge. They warn each other to trust their instincts and to be wary of who they meet on the trail. They look at the ice with a new respect, knowing what it can hide and what it can reveal. The glacier continues to move and grind and reshape the valley with its slow and steady power. And Kellen Moss knows that there are likely other secrets waiting to be found in the blue depths. The silence of the high country is deceptive because it feels empty and safe to the untrained eye. But every rock and every tree and every sheet of ice has a history that is written in time. The camera was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle that is constantly being assembled. We walk through these places as visitors, and we leave our marks whether we intend to or not. And sometimes the things we leave behind are the only voice we have left. Trucker reveals why he avoids this desert highway. The relentless heat of the Mojave Desert transforms the asphalt of State Route 127 into a shimmering mirage that distorts distance and perception. This isolated two-lane highway stretches north from Baker, California, toward the Nevada border and is frequently avoided by commercial drivers due to its lack of services. Frank Miller was a 55-year-old long-haul veteran who had spent 3 decades navigating the most desolate routes in the American Southwest. He was employed by a logistics firm based in Barstow that specialized in transporting hazardous materials to remote industrial sites near Death Valley. Miller was known among his peers as a rigid adherent to safety protocols and a man who kept his logbooks in perfect order. On the night of July 14, 2023, Miller was hauling a tanker of industrial solvent scheduled for delivery in Pahrump by sunrise. Dispatch logs from the trucking company confirmed that he departed the terminal at 2200 hours under clear skies and calm winds. The vehicle Miller operated was a customized Peterbilt 389 extended hood model that was equipped with a heavy-duty cooling system for desert operations. The truck featured a state-of-the-art telematics system that tracked the engine performance and the driver's location via satellite link every 30 seconds. Miller preferred to drive at night to avoid the blistering daytime temperatures, which could stress the engine and the tires on the hot pavement. He established a routine of checking his mirrors every 10 seconds and listening to audiobooks to maintain his alertness during the long solitary shifts. The first 2 hours of the drive were uneventful, as the truck hummed along the empty ribbon of road with the high beams cutting through the darkness. Miller noted in his voice log at midnight that the temperature outside was still hovering around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The desolation of the landscape was absolute, with no other headlights visible in either direction for over 60 miles. The incident began as Miller approached a notorious section of the highway near the Dumont Dunes, where the shifting sands often encroached on the roadway. The time was exactly 01:30 in the morning when the truck's collision avoidance system suddenly engaged the air brakes without warning. The sudden deceleration threw Miller forward against his seatbelt as the tires locked up and skidded across the gritty asphalt. The truck came to a shuddering halt in the middle of the northbound lane, surrounded by the silence of the deep desert. Miller checked the dashboard display, which indicated that the front radar sensor had detected a stationary object directly in the truck's path. He looked through the windshield, expecting to see a stalled car or perhaps a wild burro standing on the centerline. However, the road ahead was completely empty and illuminated brightly by the truck's LED light bars. Miller sat in the idling cab for several moments to allow his heart rate to settle before deciding to investigate the sensor error. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and a tire iron from beneath his seat as a precaution before opening the driver's side door. The heat of the desert night hit him instantly as he stepped down onto the running board and scanned the perimeter. He walked to the front of the truck and inspected the grille and the bumper for any sign of an impact with an animal. There was no damage to the chrome and no blood or fur that would indicate a collision had occurred. Miller then walked 50 yards down the road to the spot where the radar claimed the obstacle had been located. The asphalt was pristine and unbroken, except for the long black skid marks left by his own tires. The driver was about to return to the cab when he noticed something unusual on the sandy shoulder of the road near a mile marker post. He shone his flashlight beam onto the ground and saw a single set of boot prints leading from the desert scrub onto the pavement. The prints were fresh, and the edges of the sand were still sharp, which suggested they had been made within the last few minutes. Miller followed the tracks with his light and saw that they stopped abruptly in the middle of the right lane. There were no return tracks leading back off the road and no sign of scuffle or disturbance in the dust. It appeared as if the person who made the tracks had simply vanished into thin air upon reaching the center of the lane. Miller felt a sudden chill despite the heat and hurried back to the safety of his locked cab. He climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the doors before radioing his dispatch center to report the emergency stop and the strange tracks. The dispatcher on duty logged the call at 01:45 and noted that Miller sounded breathless and agitated. Miller stated that he felt he was being watched from the darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. He decided to pull the video file from his dashboard camera to see what had triggered the sensor before he continued driving. The camera system was designed to automatically save the 20 seconds preceding any hard braking event. Miller navigated the menu on the small screen and pressed play on the clip timestamped at 01:30. The video showed the empty road stretching out before the truck as the speedometer climbed to 65 miles per hour. The footage played normally until 3 seconds before the brakes engaged, when a glitch caused the screen to pixelate briefly. When the image stabilized, a figure was visible standing motionless in the center of the lane facing the oncoming truck. The figure appeared to be a tall male wearing tattered clothing that hung loosely from a gaunt frame. The most disturbing detail was that the figure did not have a face, but rather a smooth surface where features should have been. Miller watched in horror as the truck in the video rushed toward the figure without slowing down until the automatic brakes kicked in. In the final frame before the truck stopped, the figure seemed to dissipate like smoke or dust into the grille. Miller replayed the video 5 times, and each time the figure was clearly visible in the high-definition recording. Terrified by what he had seen, Miller put the truck in gear and accelerated away from the scene as quickly as the heavy load would allow. He drove the remaining distance to Pahrump without stopping and kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He arrived at the delivery site at 4 in the morning and refused to exit the cab until the facility's security guard approached. Miller handed over the manifest through a cracked window and told the guard he was not feeling well. He unloaded the tanker swiftly and drove immediately to a truck stop with bright lights and other people. He submitted the dashcam footage to his safety manager later that morning along with his resignation letter. Miller stated that he would never drive that stretch of Route 127 again, regardless of the pay or the urgency. The logistics company launched a full investigation into the incident to determine if the braking event was a mechanical failure or driver error. The safety team analyzed the raw video file and the telemetry data from the truck's black box. They confirmed that the radar system had indeed detected a solid mass in front of the vehicle at the specific time. However, the video experts claimed that the figure on the screen was likely a compression artifact caused by heat waves. They argued that the high temperature of the asphalt caused the air to shimmer, which the low-light sensor interpreted as a shape. This explanation failed to account for the radar data, which relies on radio waves rather than optics. The conflict between the visual evidence and the sensor data created a deadlock in the final report. State records from the California Highway Patrol show that a patrol unit was dispatched to the location of the skid marks the following day. The officer who responded to the call found the skid marks exactly where Miller had described them. The officer also found the boot prints on the shoulder leading onto the roadway, just as Miller had reported. The prints were photographed and measured, but they did not match any known footwear database used by law enforcement. The tracks ended in the middle of the lane, with no logical explanation for where the person had gone. The officer noted in the report that there were no vehicle tracks nearby that could have picked up a pedestrian. The desert floor on either side of the road was undisturbed for miles. Some locals in the nearby town of Baker have shared stories about a phantom hitchhiker who haunts that specific stretch of highway. Archives from a local newspaper in 1998 mention a drifter who died of dehydration in that area after his car broke down. The description of the drifter's clothing in the police report from that time matches the tattered rags seen in Miller's video. However, investigators never found a link between the old case and the modern sighting recorded by the truck. The lack of facial features on the figure remains a detail that does not fit with the ghost story narrative. This anomaly suggests that the phenomenon might be something more abstract or unrelated to the previous death. The dashboard camera footage was eventually archived by the company and labeled as an equipment malfunction due to environmental conditions. Miller refused to accept this conclusion and shared his story on a private forum for professional drivers. Several other truckers commented on the post, claiming they had experienced similar sensor failures in that same valley. One driver mentioned that his radio would always cut out at that mile marker and emit a high-pitched static squeal. Another driver claimed to have seen a figure running alongside his truck at 60 miles per hour. These anecdotal accounts suggest a pattern of unexplained activity that the corporate logs failed to capture. Frank Miller retired from the trucking industry entirely in 2024 and moved to a small town in Oregon to work in a lumberyard. He still suffers from nightmares about the faceless figure and refuses to drive on unlit roads at night. He kept a copy of the video file on a USB drive, which he keeps locked in a safe in his home. He told his brother that the scariest part of the video was not the figure itself, but the timestamp. The timestamp on the video jumped forward by 2 minutes during the glitch, which implies a loss of time. Miller has no memory of those missing 2 minutes and cannot account for what happened during that gap. The telemetry logs show the truck was idling, but the GPS data shows a momentary loss of signal. The truck involved in the incident was put back into service with a new driver and continued to run the same route for 6 months. The new driver reported no visual sightings but complained frequently about the radar system malfunctioning. The maintenance team eventually replaced the entire front sensor array, citing faulty wiring and heat damage. The truck was later sold to a different company and moved to a route in the Midwest. The mystery of what stood on the highway that night remains unsolved and buried in the company's digital archives. The skid marks on the asphalt have since faded, but the coordinates remain a blind spot for many drivers. Researchers from a university in Nevada later requested access to the telemetry data as part of a study on electromagnetic anomalies in the desert. The logistics company denied the request, citing proprietary information and driver privacy concerns. The researchers believe that the area may be subject to localized magnetic field distortions that affect electronic equipment. This theory would explain the radar failure and the GPS signal loss, but it does not explain the boot prints. The physical evidence of the tracks suggests a tangible presence that walked on the sand. The combination of technological failure and physical traces creates a paradox that science has yet to resolve. The stretch of State Route 127 continues to be a vital artery for transport trucks moving goods between California and Nevada. Most drivers pass through the area without incident and only see the endless expanse of scrub brush and sand. However, there is a small community of veterans who will radio ahead to check if the road is clear before entering the valley. They speak in codes and use slang to warn each other about the shadow in the lane. Frank Miller's story has become a cautionary tale among them, a reminder that technology cannot see everything. The desert keeps its secrets well, and the heat waves continue to dance on the horizon.